They told me family is a safe place. That blood is the one bond you can always trust. I used to believe that with every breath. Until the day I realized the person I trusted most had quietly taken everything I loved and built a new life on the pieces she stole from me. My name is Alina. I grew up loving birthdays, shared secrets, and late-night whispers with my sister. We were so close that when something went wrong, my first instinct was to run to her. I never imagined I would someday be the one knocking on her door, asking how she could look me in the eye and act like nothing happened. But that is the story I have to tell. Because what she did more than hurt me. It changed me. It broke me. And then, slowly, it made me into someone who refused to be invisible. This is the story of how my sister stole my life and how the revenge plan I carried out shocked everyone, including myself. I want you to hear this the way I lived it. Breath by breath, doubt by doubt, small acts of courage lit one after another. I want you to feel the weight of the betrayal and the quiet pull of the plan that grew inside me. Most of all, I want you to understand what it is like to stand back up when someone you loved destroys the world you knew. I grew up in a house that looked ordinary from the outside. White paint, a small porch, a garden my mother tended like a ritual. Inside, it was where the notes of our lives were written, laughter at the dinner table, whispered arguments about school projects, bedtime stories that stretched past midnight. My sister Mara and I shared a room until we were 14. We fought over hairbrushes, stole each other's clothes, and made secret pacts to support one another, no matter what. If you asked either of us who we were, I would have said we were inseparable. She loved to draw and I loved to write. We dreamt of moving to the city together, finding small apartments with too many books and very little money, and making art that mattered. By the time we were 22, I had a steady job at a publishing house. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and allowed me to buy my own coffee. Mara was supposed to be studying art in a nearby city. She called every week. We visited each other. We celebrated small victories. Everything looked normal. I should have seen the first cracks sooner. But when you are wrapped in the comfort of family, you learn to ignore the tiny shifts. The missed calls that become texts. The small excuses. The stories that don't quite add up. When it first happened, I told myself she was tired, stressed. I believed her, because belief was easier than suspicion. The first real sign came with a job opportunity. I had been waiting for a small editorial role at a magazine that specialized in the kind of literary work I loved. I had applied in secret, because I didn't want to jinx it. When the call came offering me the position, I kept it quiet for a few days, until I could sign the contract. I wanted to surprise my family. Mara knew that job mattered to me. She had actually helped me with the application, reading over my cover letter, suggesting edits. She celebrated when I got the call, or at least she pretended to. The launch of this new chapter in my life should have been a moment of joy. Instead, it was the moment everything started to slip away. When I finally told my parents and Mara about the job, they were thrilled. We had dinner and opened a cheap bottle of wine. It was one of those nights where the world felt right. Mara hugged me like only a sister could. 2 weeks later, the magazine's editor called to say the offer had been rescinded. My name had been taken off the contract. They told me another candidate, with similar qualifications, had been hired. I felt the ground beneath me shift. I called the editor back, begged for reasons, but the explanation was vague. An internal reorganization, budget changes. The rug had been pulled out from under me. It was Mara who suggested a simple theory. Maybe something had gone wrong with the paperwork. She'll offer to help me investigate. And I was so grateful for her presence that I didn't notice the small ways she smiled when she said it. She offered to accompany me to the magazine office to speak to HR. I should have wanted to go alone. I should have asked questions. Instead, I trusted her. At the HR office, I was polite, exhausted, and naive. Notes were misplaced, emails were supposedly lost, and the editor could not recall the specifics of the hiring process. Then someone pointed me to a social media post. The person who took the job had celebrated their new role in the same circles I frequented. Her portfolio looked eerily familiar to me, a set of essays with a voice that mirrored my own style. My stomach dropped. I took screenshots, traced dates, and compared versions of essays. A line here, a phrase there. Claimed projects matched pieces I'd shared in private online groups. My heart pounded. That's when I found something that made my hands shake. A photograph on that person's account. Friendly face I recognized, Mara's friend. The friend had visited the magazine for an interview, and Mara's name appeared in the comments. Congratulating the new hire. It was a small thing, a comment, a like, a congratulatory emoji. But it felt like the first hint of knives under the table. I confronted Mara when I came home. She laughed at first. It's not like that, she said, brushing my voice aside like an annoying fly. Maybe someone used your ideas. People borrow things all the time. But later, when I pressed harder, she grew distant. She became the sister who changed the subject and walked out. I remember sitting in the dark of my living room, feeling something inside me break in a way I couldn't name. I decided to let it go, because at the time, I didn't have the strength to face the truth. What followed was months of small disappearances. Not money at first. Those were the kind of things people notice quickly. It was quieter. A personal essay I had written for a private blog showing up in someone else's public portfolio. A piece of jewelry I had left with Mara for safekeeping suddenly appearing on her when she visited a party. An invitation that was supposed to be mine. That arrived at her address with a note signed with my name. Each time I raised my voice, she had a reason. I meant to tell you, she'd say. I thought you'd like it this way. She learned to mimic remorse like a mask. She apologized with tears that felt rehearsed. My parents, caught between sisters, suggested mediation, conversation, forgiveness. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to not hate my sister. I wanted to go back to the nights when we read poetry under a single lamp and shared dreams. But the pattern grew bolder. When I applied for a fellowship at a small literary retreat, I was shortlisted. The acceptance should have been mine, but the retreat director called to say they had reserved the final spot for someone else, a candidate of exceptional talent. The voice on the line was kind, polite, unfamiliar. When I checked online, the person's portfolio included the exact structure of a short story I had shared with a close friend months prior. It was not just copying. It was the theft of opportunities, of credit, of identity. I began to feel my life thinning like a sweater losing thread by thread. When I started to document things, screenshots, dates, saved drafts, I found evidence that suggested a pattern I couldn't ignore. There were emails forwarded to addresses I had never used. Drafts opened from devices I didn't recognize, and messages sent in my name. It was as if someone had quietly built a parallel life using my voice. I thought it might be professional sabotage. I filed complaints. HR said they would look into it. Agents advised me to secure my accounts. But complaints and locked passwords felt like putting band-aids on a broken dam. The person using my words and my stories moved easily between circles, charming those who would sooner listen to a new voice than slow down to recognize the origin of an idea. I wanted to believe it was an outsider. I wanted to believe it wasn't my sister. But the evidence, the timing, the social connections, the curious presence of people who seemed to bridge my world and hers, pulled at a different conclusion. I remember the night I found the proof. It was raining, the kind of heavy rain that made the streetlight glow like a stage lamp. I had been awake for hours, scouring through email headers, cross-referencing timestamps, calling friends back and forth. Exhaustion made me reckless. Logged into a cloud account I had shared with Mara years ago, a place where we had once collaborated on a silly zine as kids. There, among the old drafts, I found a folder with the recent times, names I recognized, documents that had my handwriting, my voice, but with small edits and polished signatures. One file stood out, a contract with the magazine that had rescinded my offer. It bore a digital signature, Mara's. I fell back on the couch and the world spun. I called my mother and told her. She cried and told me she did not believe it. She wouldn't do that to you, she said. But the proof glowed on my laptop like an accusation. My hands moved and my face felt numb. I could see, in those documents, how Mara had quietly used my drafts, my ideas, my credentials, and inserted herself into positions meant for me. I confronted her the next morning. She answered the door, dressed carefully, as if readying for an audience. For a moment, she looked ashamed. Okay. Then her expression hardened. "Why are you looking through my things?" she asked. "Those aren't your contracts," I said. "You signed for a job I was offered." She laughed a brittle laugh and denied everything. "I never took anything of yours. You're being ridiculous." It was a moment that knocked the breath out of me. The sister I had shared so much with now lied with ease. Her bravado created a dam between us. It made me dizzy to watch someone I loved become a stranger in a single conversation. My parents tried to mediate, and for a while, I believed that truth would be enough. Mara agreed to return the documents and apologize. But apologies did not change the emails that had been sent. The contracts that bore her name. The opportunities she had enjoyed at my expense. She returned some things, but not the truth. She controlled the narrative with small confessions, as if choosing what to admit was her way of being generous. The most cruel part was watching others take her side, because she had a charisma that made her believable. She was the daughter who smiled in family photos, the friend who remembered birthdays, the artist who could charm a critic with a single gesture. I was the angry sister who had accused her. The world is often kinder to charm than to accusation. After the confrontation, I shut down. I stopped attending family dinners. I spent hours in my apartment, going through every file I had ever saved, every message I had ever sent. I sifted through my past like an archaeologist, dusting for fingerprints. It was painful and necessary. The more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. There were emails Mara had forwarded from my address to other people. There were drafts she had polished and presented as her work. There were conversations she had with gatekeepers where she had used inside knowledge only. I would have. It was as if she had taken snippets of my life and threaded them into a new fabric that fit her better than the person she had left behind. I remember sitting on my balcony at night, the city below like a carpet of small lights, feeling grief and rage in equal measure. It felt wrong to be furious with someone who had held my hand as a child. But grief was the louder emotion at first. Grief for the person I had been and for the trust that had been eroded. I considered leaving town, starting over somewhere. My name meant something different. I thought about legal action. I thought about confronting every publisher, every agent, every friend who might have been misled. But the idea of a courtroom, the formal grind of law, felt too technical for the wound I was nursing. I didn't want countersuits and depositions. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted the stolen pieces returned. What I realized slowly, like a light turning on in a dark room, was that this was not just about getting evidence or forcing a legal hand. It was about reclaiming my story and making sure my sister could not continue to profit from a life she had built with borrowed pieces. If I wanted to be heard, I needed a plan that was precise, public, and undeniable. I am not an expert in revenge. I do not have a knack for drama or the cunning minds you see in movies. I am a woman with a sense of justice and the patience to wait for the right moment. My plan was not to humiliate for the thrill. It was to expose the truth in a way that my sister's charm could not rewrite. I started small and practical. I would compile an undeniable timeline of ownership and authorship. I would gather witnesses who had been part of my creative process. I would use the tools everyone trusted: metadata, timestamps, archived drafts, server logs. I would make it impossible for anyone to honestly say they did not know. And I would do it in a space where the truth could not be gaslighted away. Public record and community memory. I found a digital forensics volunteer online, a quiet, older woman who worked for a nonprofit and believed in writing small injustices. She taught me how to extract metadata, how to trace IP addresses, and how to subpoena digital records when necessary. She taught me how to document conversations without breaking any laws. Screenshots, recorded interviews with consent, and cloud snapshots. I also reached out to friends. The ones who had read my drafts, and the people who had seen me perform my work live. Their testimonies were small, but powerful. A neighbor who had seen me working on a story at midnight. A friend who had emailed me a critique. A mentor who had recommended me for an opportunity. Each voice, when added to the pile, created a pattern that looked less like coincidence and more like theft. But I also learned that evidence alone is not always enough. People need context. They need narrative. So I began to craft that narrative. I wrote a personal essay about my experience. Not to publish immediately, but to clarify how I would tell the story if I had the chance. Writing, for me, was therapy and strategy. It helped me shape the moments I needed to highlight. The first time Mara smiled when I got good news. The way she would linger over my drafts. The conversations that had become fingerprints on my life. I did something else that felt almost childish but proved essential. I created small, almost casual markers that only I could explain. I wrote hidden lines in drafts, tiny references to childhood memories no one else would use, notes in the margins, in an odd handwriting I alone used. I circulated those drafts in private spaces where Mara could not access them. The idea was simple. If someone else later presented those words as their own, the presence of unique markers would be the thread that tied things together. No plan is without setbacks. For every piece of evidence I found, there was a moment of self-doubt. Friends suggested I was being paranoid. My mother begged me to forgive and forget. My sister, sensing something, pivoted to damage control. She started to apologize more publicly, to post images of charity work, to present herself as a wounded artist who had simply made mistakes. There were nights when I wanted to stop, when I considered letting the world think what it wanted. The loneliness of being the accuser in a loved family cut deep. People are more comfortable with the story that keeps the peace. They tend to believe the person who smiles in photos and brings cakes to family gatherings. It felt as if the universe preferred a nice lie to a messy truth. Time and again, I found myself back at the desk, combing through timestamps, calling witnesses, and rewriting the narrative I would present. I learned to anticipate how people would respond. I learned to keep calm when provoked. I learned to save my anger for evidence, and to turn my grief into clarity. One painful setback came when someone I thought would be an ally, a former editor, who had once praised my early work, publicly endorsed Mara's pieces. After a friendly conversation, I felt my stomach drop. It was like watching a small wave wash away one of my But then, on deeper inspection, I found a pattern in the editor's praise. He had been shown versions of my work that included my hidden markers, and his commendation only strengthened my case. The endorsement became evidence that my words had been passed along and admired, even when I was not credited. Slowly, the evidence hardened into a strong pile. The digital forensics volunteer confirmed IP traces that matched Mara's devices to accounts used to submit my drafts. An old colleague remembered seeing a physical copy of my story on Mara's table. A publisher sent a note acknowledging they had received a submission eerily similar to my own months earlier. With each small win, my fear diminished, and my resolve grew. I began to think about how to make the exposure public without turning it into a spectacle. I didn't want a courtroom drama. I wanted a confession that could not be ignored. I wanted consequences that matched the theft, the restoration of lost opportunities, a public acknowledgement, and a ban on using my work. I drafted a letter to the literary community, a clear, calm narrative that laid out the timeline and presented the evidence. I asked the leaders in my world to look with a sober eye. I included attachments, timestamps, and witness statements. I asked for fairness, not blood. At the same time, I prepared a plan for the moment when the truth would need to be presented in a way that could not be swatted away by charisma. I arranged a small gathering of trusted professionals, editors, a lawyer who specialized in intellectual property, and a journalist I respected. I gave each of them a copy of the dossier and asked them to review it privately. The day I decided to go public felt like stepping off a cliff with a parachute I hadn't yet tested. There was no dramatic scene where I marched into a room and declared the truth to a hushed crowd. It was quieter. I published my essay on a respected independent platform that allowed me to attach the dossier and included the small, verifiable markers I'd planted. I asked the platform to hold it for a day, to let the legal team review, and to schedule a release time at noon. I shared the link with my carefully selected list of people. The journalist I trusted wrote a follow-up piece that contextualized the evidence. Editors I had alerted sent private messages expressing shock. The small literary circles I moved in began to buzz, with a kind of energy I had not felt since the first time. One of my stories was read aloud in public. Mara's reaction was immediate. At first, she posted an apology that read like a press release, contrite but vague. Then she tried to push back, calling the evidence misleading, claiming she had not intended harm. Friends and family fell into the same predictable roles: defenders, skeptics, and those who waited to see which side would break. The turning point came when a respected editor I admired published a clear statement. He had been shown drafts by Mara that contained my hidden markers, and he was prepared to support an investigation. When that person, whose name meant authority in our circles, spoke up, the tide turned. Publishers who had once overlooked my claims reached out to offer amends. A small fellowship that had previously accepted a candidate presenting my work under another name offered to revisit their decision. Public pressure, combined with clear evidence, made it hard for institutions to look away. The consequences were not immediate, and they were not tidy. Mara did not crumble in the way I had imagined. Instead, she tried again to negotiate the narrative. She offered partial apologies and admitted to borrowing ideas without understanding the damage. But the records were clearer than her words. As the evidence accumulated in public view, some of the doors that had opened to her began to close. Invitations stopped coming. Editors who had once praised her work reviewed their notes and noticed similarities they had missed. People I had thought were indifferent reached out with apologies and a desire to help put things right. The most painful part of the fallout was the family. My parents were torn. They loved both of us and were not ready to abandon a child. Yet, the proof was undeniable. There were moments of awful silence at the dinner table, and nights when my mother would cry quietly in the kitchen. She did not yet know how to reconcile loving both her daughters when one had caused irrevocable harm. Mara, at times, seemed stunned by the loss of the life she had been building. Her friends dwindled. She lost commissions and invitations. But she also kept some people close, those who believed in forgiveness, or who had been charmed by her, for reasons I could not fully understand. One morning, months after the exposure, Mara sat across from me with a face I did not recognize. The arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by a raw, trembling kind of vulnerability. She apologized fully for the first time, without equivocation. She admitted that she had been jealous, small, and afraid of obscurity. She said she had stolen not only my words, but a part of my future. Her tears were real. They did not erase the damage, but they were honest. I forgave her in a way that surprised me, not because the wound had disappeared, but because forgiveness felt like a step toward my own peace. I told her that she needed to account for her choices, and to rebuild, honestly. Part of that rebuilding required her to acknowledge publicly what she had done. It required concrete steps, returning commissions, offering credit where it was due, and undergoing counseling. Throughout the process, I found allies in places I had not expected. A young writer who had once been dismissed by the same circles reached out to say how my courage had given him permission to speak about his own experiences. An editor who had been on the fence told me in private that my careful documentation made a difference. One by one, people who had silently suspected but lacked proof came forward. The literary community, while imperfect, surprised me by choosing to prioritize truth over comfort. Institutions that had been reluctant to intervene found themselves facing a moral decision, and mostly chose to act. They revised credits, offered apologies, and discussed how they would prevent similar misuse of authorship in the future. The small fellowship I had once been passed over for offered me a seat, acknowledging the mistake. A magazine that had been considering Mara's work reached out to ask if I would be willing to contribute the piece I had written. The offer felt like a gentle nudge back toward the life that had been interrupted. It was not reparations in the big money sense. There were no giant payouts. But there were restorations, invitations, acknowledgments, and the return of pieces of my identity. Those gestures mattered, because they recognized what had been taken. Revenge, I learned, is not always about spectacle. For me, the true revenge was reclaiming my voice, and refusing to allow my life to be defined by what was stolen. As the dust settled, I began to focus on healing. I started therapy. Not because I was broken beyond repair, but because I wanted to understand how I had allowed someone to quietly become a thief in my life. Therapy helped me see patterns I had missed. Times when I had minimized my own worth in favor of being the agreeable sister, the compromises I made to keep the peace, and the cultural pressures that reward charisma over quiet labor. I learned to set boundaries, to ask for credit, to protect my digital footprints, and to value my own work. I also began to write again, not as a task, but as a reclamation. I put words on the page with more fierceness and tenderness than before. My stories were different now, more honest about betrayal and the thin lines between love and envy. They were not about revenge so much as recognition. They honored the small, private acts that shape who we become. The family remained complicated. Some wounds healed, some scars remained. My parents took long walks with each of us separately. They gave me time and space to be angry, and they sat in silence when I needed them to listen. Mara and I began to meet for coffee, trying to rebuild something that looked like a relationship but was, in truth, new and unfamiliar. We did not return to the easy intimacy of our childhood. Trust, once broken, does not stitch back together smoothly. We learned to talk about boundaries. She attended therapy and admitted to patterns of envy and impulsivity she had never recognized. She agreed to publicly credit works that had derived from my drafts and to participate in panels about authorship ethics. These were not grand gestures, but they were honest ones. The most important moment came one quiet afternoon when she handed me a notebook. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I only want to ask for it someday." Inside the notebook were notes, terrible attempts at apology, and pages of reflections. It was imperfect, but it was hers. Once my story became public, others began to share similar experiences. Friends who had their recipes copied, researchers whose data was presented by someone else, performers whose choreography was repackaged under another name. The conversation expanded beyond my family and into the broader culture. I partnered with a small nonprofit that helped creators protect their work. We ran workshops on digital safety, metadata, and the ethics of collaboration. We urged institutions to adopt better verification processes and to train editors and gatekeepers to look for the small things that indicate authorship. The aim was not to punish, but to prevent. We also started a conversation about how we respond to betrayal within families. Too often, the instinct is to cover, ignore, or minimize. We encouraged honest dialogue, accountability, and tangible restitution when harm had been done. The goal was to make it easier for others who faced similar hurt to speak up without fear of being dismissed. Justice in this story was not cinematic. There were no dramatic arrests or public shaming. The reckoning came in smaller, quieter ways. Mara lost some opportunities and gained some therapy. She publicly acknowledged her wrongs. I received offers to publish, to teach, and to speak on panels where I could help others avoid what I had gone through. People often ask me if I felt satisfied when the truth came out. The answer is complicated. I did feel a fierce relief, like finally being able to breathe after holding my chest. But relief does not erase the ache of betrayal. I remained careful about whom I trusted. I remained aware that some wounds leave marks that never fully fade. The bigger satisfaction came from seeing systems respond: journals, changing submission policies, institutions asking harder questions, and creators learning to protect their work. My experience became a cautionary tale that, I hope, helped others. If there is a moral in my story, it is this: family can be a place of both great warmth and deep harm. The most devastating betrayals often hide in the small, ordinary moments. They look like favors, like hugs, like late-night help. But harm is harm, and love is not an excuse for theft. Justice, too, is often quieter than we imagine. It comes not through spectacle, but through persistence, evidence, and the courage to claim your own story. Revenge, when it is righteous, looks less like punishment and more like restoration, the restoration of truth, of credit, and of identity. I am not proud of the way I felt at times, the desire to humiliate, to expose without mercy. Those feelings are human, and I do not pretend they were noble. What I am proud of is that I chose a path that aimed for accountability and repair. I chose to rebuild in a way that allowed me to hold boundaries and still be compassionate. Months after the truth became known, I stood on a small stage in a library, reading a story about two sisters who shared a room and then grew into different people. The audience listened in silence. After the reading, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Your story made me feel brave enough to ask for credit," she said. "I've been afraid to speak up." That moment, more than any vindication, felt like the true reward. The world is messy. People will hurt each other, and sometimes those hurt are the ones who hug us. But there is also the chance for repair, for lessons learned, and for better futures built with care. If you are listening to this and find a similar ache in your chest, know this: your story matters. Keep records. Protect your work. Find allies. And when the time is right, speak your truth in a way that cannot be ignored. The road will not be easy, and the outcomes will not be perfect. But you will reclaim pieces of yourself one by one. I do not want to end this with triumphalism. My sister and I still have a relationship that is complicated and tender in parts. We are learning to be sisters without the same illusions. I still feel the scars when certain memories rise. But I have a life that is mine. I have work that carries my voice. I have a community that recognizes the importance of truth. If there is one lesson I would give anyone who has been betrayed by someone close, whether family, friend, or colleague, it is this: do not let shame keep you quiet. Protect yourself with facts and witnesses. Seek allies who will help you speak in ways that matter. And remember that healing is not linear. It comes in small steps, in new boundaries, and in the reclaiming of small things: a sentence, a job, a reputation, until the whole shape of your life begins to feel knit again. Thank you for listening to my story. If you take nothing else with you, take this: our lives are made of stories, and when someone tries to claim our story as their own, we have the right to take it back.